Shalom, shalom. All esteemed to Yahuwah. Welcome again to the Reset the Frequency podcast. I am your host, El Hanuk. I know before it was El Yehuda Hanuk, but newsflash, Yahuwah has given me a renewed name. He's actually taken the Yehuda off, so now it's just El Hanuk. And it's definitely a spiritual thing, just like Yahuwah changed the name of Jacob or Yaakov to Yashrael. He has changed my name and he's given me a new initiative. So there are a lot of things that I'm doing now to walk in a higher level of authority and power. So all esteem to Yahuwah for that. Just wanted to update you all and let you know that. But all esteem to Yahuwah. This is episode 5. I know last time we dealt with ancient Hebrew thought. It was definitely Tov. We definitely were able to deal with the 5 senses, deal with certain things that Hebraically will allow you to interpret the scriptures that were originally written in Hebrew better than in the English language, which is abstract, versus the Hebrew language, which is concrete, right? So we talked about what abstract means versus what concrete means, what Eastern thought is versus Western thought, and how ultimately it all goes back to, again, the Hebrew language being connected to the ground, the land, and the lifestyle, the culture of the ancient Hebrew people, right? So with all that being said, today we're going to pick up basically where we left off. And we're going to keep going. We're, again, diving in the ancient Hebrew lexicon, right? Written by Jeff A. Benner, right? Excellent tool and a resource for Yahuwah's people to get a deeper revelation or understanding of the original script, the original word from the original manuscript that has been, and we talked about this in some of the earlier lessons, has been, tainted and to a certain degree played with in the translations of the scripts, right? We had something called the Septuagint that we talked about in the past, and obviously Yah's word still stands strong, right? Those who have the Ruach are still able to perceive or understand above and beyond the deception that the enemy tries to snare us with the language barrier. But this is ultimately why Yahuwah is increasing knowledge in this time, right? We are in the age of enlightenment. We are in the age of knowledge, where I believe the prophet Daniel said, in the end times, in the latter times, knowledge will increase, right? And so because of that, Yahuwah has given us these type of tools and these resources and waking us up as we await the return of our King, Yahushua HaMashiach. Hallelujah. So again, this is why this is important, because it's going to help you understand and dissect the depth of the meaning of every Hebrew word, every Hebrew letter, right, that make up the words that Yahuwah, our Abba, our Elohim, our power, communicated to us through the prophets and, hallelujah, the prophets, the apostles, obviously Yahushua and the Besoras and so forth, the writings, the Psalms, the Proverbs, right, all the various sections of our manuscript, right? So this is dealing with today the ancient Hebrew AlephBet, specifically the evolution, right, of the ancient Hebrew AlephBet, or as today they would say, the alphabet, right? But we know that the first letter in the Hebrew language is the Aleph, so that's why we call it the AlephBet, right? So the Hebrew AlephBet was written with a script belonging to the Semitic family of languages, right? And I don't know if we talked about this before, but today we can definitely elaborate on it. Semitic just means a descendant of Shem, right? Noah, right? The progenitor of the human race after the flood, right? Because Yahuwah set him apart and his family apart and had him take, 2 of each animal and put them on the ark. When Yahuwah, to a certain degree, reset the frequency of the earth, right, in the great flood. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 6. Shem is a son of Noah. Noah had 3 sons: Shem, Ham, and Japheth, also known as Japheth, right? So these 3 men were the progenitors, or technically the fathers, of all the races, or I guess you could say tribes, nations is a better term, because that idea of race is weird. We'll talk about that later. But all the nations in the earth that you see today, and obviously nations have languages that they speak to communicate, right? So Semitic ties directly to all the descendants of Shem, right? And you can read more in the earlier chapters of Genesis about the descendants of Shem, I believe in Genesis chapter 10 and chapters 11. They go deeper into all the lineages of all the sons of Noah. And that's ultimately how the earth became populated after the flood, right? So just some history there to help you get an understanding of, when you hear me speak the term Semitic, it's not what they say in the news today, right? The idea of being anti-Semitic and all that stuff, it has been played with, and most people don't know who the true Semites are in the earth because of lies, deception, and colonialism. I'm gonna just be honest with you. Colonialism and the European nations that have taken over and become superpowers and have gone into the regions of the Mediterranean and the regions of Africa and different places and colonized. They have, so to speak, began to, particularly in the Western world, they began to control the narrative of who the true descendants of Shem are. So, saying all this to say, Semitic, and we're gonna prove this today in this lesson. But the idea of Semitic all goes back to being a descendant of Shem, right? And if you read the Zondervan Bible Dictionary, will give you a description for Ham, and they will say he is the father of the dark races, but in parentheses they'll put not the Negroes. You wonder, why is that? Well, the reason why they put that, and again, Zondervan being a publication company for most Christian books, dictionaries, as well as I believe they do have different lexicons and concordances to help people, understand the Greek and the Hebrew origin of certain words when they're studying the English Bible. But the reason why Zondervan put that, right, that Ham is the father of all the dark races, but in parentheses, not the Negroes, is because ultimately they have information, right? Proven, documented information to prove that the quote unquote Negro people are actually descendants of Shem, right? Just like the Arabics, right? Just like the Indians, right? And when I say Indians, I'm not necessarily talking Native American, even though Native Americans are also descendants of Shem. We'll talk more about that later too. But when I say Indian, I'm talking about Indian in the sense of people that are indigenous to the land of Asia. So the country India, right? Which is why you see so many similarities in features, whether it be hair, whether it be facial features, right? Whether it be skin complexion, whether it be skin tone. And watch this, even the languages, right? Not just in Asia and Africa, but also, I'm sorry, not just in Asia, but also in Africa, right? You got many, 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 many tribes and nations that still speak Semitic languages to this day. So again, Hebrew is not the only Semitic language out here. And how to prove that what I'm telling you is accurate and of a truth historically and biblically, right, is the, I don't know if you've ever heard of the language that is spoken in a lot of schools, right? A lot of schools speak and teach, particularly here in America, right? A lot of languages, not just Hebrew, but also the idea of African languages, right? Swahili. I know you've probably heard that term before, but that is also a Semitic language, right? Now, I'm not saying that every nation that speaks Semitic languages are descendants of Shem, but for the most part, they are. Because again, these regions were all they all developed and formed during the same time period, during the same region, which was in ancient Babylon, right? This is after the flood, Nimrod, right? You read this in Genesis chapter 11, right? They wanted to build a tower that reached to heaven. And what did Yahuwah do? Yahuwah came and confounded the languages. That means that he mixed up the languages. So that's ultimately where you'll see that cuneiform and all these different languages were in operation. But after Yahuwah came and confounded the languages began to break up and split up and follow people into the various regions that they went to when they spread out from where ancient Babylon was, which is modern day Iraq, also known as ancient Mesopotamia, right? So just giving you some history on the depth of what it means, what the term Semitic actually means. Is so much deeper than what you hear in the media and in the news today, because a lot of people are confused as to who the true Semites are. But I'm here to tell you, if you are of the Negro race, the so-called African American race, you in fact are a descendant of Shem. Hallelujah. So just putting that out there. But the Hebrew AlephBet was written with a script belonging to the Semitic family of languages, right? So the Semitic script followed three basic stages of development. I'm going to go over all three of them with you, and I'm going to give you examples of what these languages look like, because even to this day, right, all three of these languages, right, or these writing systems are still used to this day by various cultures, right? So the first stage, right, would be the early Semitic script, right? The early script, the early Semitic script, or the early, I should say, Hebrew script, right? Or Avrit is how you pronounce it in Hebrew, right? So you have the early, which is the first stage. Then the second stage you have is the middle script, right? And we'll definitely talk about that as well in the later in the teaching. And then third, or last but not least, we have the late Semitic script, right? And we'll talk about that as well. That's also known as modern Hebrew, which is ultimately the language that you see the majority of people in the land of Yisrael and in various parts of the world, for the most part, speaking, right? So let's start with the early Semitic script. Hallelujah, right? So the early Semitic script was pictographic, right? Where each letter represented an object. And again, the reason it was pictographic is because of what we talked about in the last episode, is the fact that ancient Hebrew corresponds with the five senses, right? Sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch, or also feel, right? And this ultimately brings you into the idea of how our people were big on connection. Why? Because our people were connected to the ground, the land, right? That's why you see so many examples in the script regarding seed time and harvest time, right? The sun going down, the sun coming up, right? And it's ultimately because our people were deeply connected to the land, right? We didn't have a lot of the things that we have today, and I talked about this before. So the early Semitic script, again, it was pictograph. It was a pictograph, right? And I'm gonna give you an example. I'm gonna show you what it looked like. Hold on. So this is an example. Hopefully you can see it there. This is an example of what the pictograph or the early Hebrew script looked like, right? And again, it reads from right to left, not left to right, but right to left. And this is obviously Yahuwah's name, Yod, Hey, Wah, or Va, Hey, right? So again, these are pictures that actually represent specific things that correspond with what? The five senses. So let's prove it, right? We have a Yod, and again, obviously there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. We're not going to go over all of them today, but I will later do a video where I go over all the letters. But let's just take Yahuwah's name, for example. We have Yod, right? Which goes back to the idea of an arm. So you see, if you really look at it, stick figurely, you can kind of see this Yod representing an arm, this being the arm, and this being like the hand, right? Then you have a Hey, right? Hopefully you can see this good. But then you have a Hey, right? Which is a little bit more self-explanatory. You literally have a man that look like a stick figure, right? You see his head, his arms, his legs, right? But you have a man with his hands raised high, looking at a great sight. So again, these are actual living movements that these letters represent, right? Somebody in action doing something for the most part, right? Someone or something, right? Noun. So then you have a yod, or not a yod, I'm sorry, a vav or a wah, right? Depending on which dialect of Hebrew, some people pronounce it va or some people pronounce it wah. But this wah goes back to a nail, a tent peg or a nail, right? That's why it literally looks like a nail, because it's literally holding down the tent pole to the earth. Or I'm sorry, it's holding down the tent, the size of a tent to the earth, so that when the wind blows, guess what? The tent stands strong, right? And that letter is deeply connected to the idea of faith, which we'll definitely talk about later in the podcast. And then we have a hey again. So just giving you these examples to show you that early Semitic Hebrew script was actually pictograph, right? And again, these are pictures for the most part that they were using as a form of their language, right? A written form of their language to be able to communicate with one another. Now, I'm going to share this too. The early Semitic script, right, or the early Hebrew Semitic script, rather, was also the same letter system and language as the Phoenicians, right? Same letter system as the Phoenicians, right? And to give you a little bit of insight on the Phoenicians, right? Phoenician was a language spoken by the ancient Canaanites. So wait a minute, Canaanites? Yeah, ancient Canaanites, who were descendants of Ham. Yeah, I know it sounds like, oh, wait a minute. If they're descendants of Ham, why wouldn't they speak, right, Hamitic language? Because there is such a thing as Hamitic languages. Well, guess what? The land of Canaan, right, is in the region that is now known as Israel. So it's a very spiritual reason as to why they spoke those languages. But the best answer I can give you is it all goes back to ancient Babylon. What happened during that time period when Yahuwah confounded the language, right? So not only did the ancient Canaanites speak Phoenician, but watch this, y'all. Due to it being a Semitic language, it was very similar to Akkadian, right? It was very similar to Akkadian, right? So we know for a fact that Abraham spoke Phoenician, right? We know for a fact that Abraham, he spoke Phoenician. So what that means is that the region where he came from before he migrated to the land of Canaan, right? Remember, he was in the land of Ur, i.e. ancient Babylon, also known as ancient Mesopotamia. And Yahuwah removed him from the land of Ur and brought him where? To the land of Canaan, also known as the land flowing with milk and honey. So saying all this to say, this is the same language that the ancient Phoenicians spoke. This is why Abraham could understand and speak with the people when he migrated to the land of Canaan, because they spoke the same language, right? And that's so deep, like that concept, when you understand that it's so deep, this is how you know that, the majority of the nations during that time period, right? Egyptians included, all these languages for the most part were very, very, very similar, because they all go back to, again, the first original language, which was cuneiform. So they were definitely able to understand who Yahuwah was, right? You read Genesis chapter 22, right? You'll see that Avimelech, right, the Philistine king, right? He was able to understand the language that Abraham spoke. Why? Because they all spoke similar languages, right? So I could go deeper into that, but for time, I do kind of want to keep going. So, Phoenician, also called the early linear script, was also used by, like I said, ancient Canaanites and other nations around that region. So again, this would also include the cities. So the cities that spoke Phoenician, many of these were city-states that belonged to the Phoenicians. So you had Byblos, which really goes back to Babylon, right? You also had Assyria, right? Or the Assyrian races, or the Assyrian, nation, city state, right? And again, all of this goes back to ancient Babel, right? And this is how you know for a fact that the ancient Egyptians, right? They understood the language as well. Why? Because everybody at a certain point was in Babylon. And before Yahuwah confounded the languages, they all were able to understand each other. So, let's keep going. They referred to this writing system. So again, the ancient Hebrew Semitic script, they referred to this writing system as Abad, Abjad, a writing system where only consonants are represented, right? Leaving vowel sounds to be interpreted by the reader. So guess what? That meant that there were no vowels in the language. The interpreter would have to determine how they would enunciate anything that would be seen as a vowel. And this is ultimately why you have people who pronounce the name. I'm going to just use this as an example. The name of Yahuwah differently. Some people say Yahuwah. Some people say Yahweh. Well, guess what? It's ultimately because, again, the interpretation of how to enunciate the vowels is left up to the reader or to the person speaking the word, right? So in different regions of Israel, you had people who pronounced these things differently. So this is ultimately why the word can actually be the exact same with the exact same letters, but pronounced differently. Hallelujah. Hopefully that makes sense, right? So let's keep going. So next would be the middle script, right? Also known as the paleo script, right? The middle script, also known as the paleo script. So the middle script, or the middle Semitic script, is an evolved form of the original pictographic script into a simpler form and used by different Semitic groups. Watch this, including the Hebrews, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Armenians, and many others. So what happened is, as time went on, and you for sure will see this during the time period of like Moses, Moshe. During that time, but this is after Abraham's time period, as more nations began to develop. Because what was the prophecy about Abraham? Right, he would be the father of many nations. As more nations began to develop, right, the writing system would evolve and develop as well, right? But it's the same language though, right? Same principles, same connection to the ground, to the land, to the earth, right? Dealing with the concrete senses of man, right? So this is ultimately what was being spoken during the time period of Moses, all the way up until, I would say, around 600 BC, somewhere in that region, right? 700 BC, around the time period of the captivity of our ancestors that were taken captive by Nimrod in ancient Babylon, right? So saying all this to say, this was definitely a language that was heavily, or not a language, but a form of this language that was more widespread for a longer time period that you see in the script, because that's a long time period. A time period from from Moses all the way up and through Yashayahu and the kings that were in his sons that were in power during the time period where the first temple was destroyed, right? So again, these are this is ultimately what this language looks like. I'm gonna give you an example of just like how I gave you the pictograph. I'm gonna give you an example of the paleo, which you've seen this before, right? But Yod, Hey, Wah, Hey, right? So you can still kind of see a resemblance of the pictograph in the Yod, right? The Hey, the Wah, Shalom, my Shalom. Hey, we're talking about Hebrew language. Hallelujah. Yeah, Yod, Hey, Wah, Hey. See? Prince, no. Yod, Hey, Wah, Hey. Right? And that's what's told about these languages too, is because they're they connect to the senses, right? Because they connect to the senses, it's easier to teach a child these languages because, again, you're showing them pictures. You're giving them examples of languages where pictures are being shown, right? So again, you can see the resemblance, but again, it did evolve over time with the yod, then the hey, right? It kind of looks like an E with a stick on it, but again, if you were to turn it over, it still kind of looks like a head, two hands, right? Yeah, I don't know about this tail here, but still, to a certain degree, you can still kind of see the resemblance of the pictograph hey. And then, like I said, the Y is exactly the same, right? The Y does not change, and then the hey again, right? So again, this is a example of what the paleo, right, or the middle script looks like. And again, it was used by a lot of other nations during that time period because more nations were developing in that in and around that region, right? So it talks about Moab, descendants of Lot, right? Ammonite, Ammon, descendants of Lot, right? Which was Abraham's nephew, right? Then you had, who else did we have on here? Arameans, right? Aram, again, descendants of Shem, right? Aram, descendants of Shem, who were still in that same Mediterranean region, right? And I could go on, but for time, I'm going to keep going. So again, this idea of the middle script or the paleo is where you'll see the majority of the script during those time periods was written in, right? Most people say that all Torah, and most historians that do have, the facts when it comes to the dates of when certain scripts were written, obviously, inspired by Yah, written by man, certain prophets, specifically Moses, who wrote the first 5 books, being inspired by Yahuwah's spirit, his Ruach. They say he wrote them in Paleo, right? Because the language had evolved to that at that time. So that would be obviously the first 5 books, probably the book of Yahusha, probably the book of Judges, and so forth, up until you get to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, around the time period where our ancestors actually went into captivity. Hallelujah. So just kind of giving you a timeline, right? So number 3, right? So we dealt with early, which is the pictograph. We dealt with the middle, which is the paleo, right? And 3, hallelujah, we're dealing with the Aramaic, right? I know that sounds funny, Aram, but Aramaic language, or the Aramaic script, which is also known as modern Hebrew. So I'm going to read this from the lexicon, and then I'm going to elaborate on it. So the Aramaic script of the Arameans in Babylon evolved into the late Semitic script independently from other Semitic scripts. When the Hebrew people were taken into Babylonian captivity, they adopted the Aramaic script and is still in use to this day. So the majority of like, for example, if you go on Bible Hub and you want to look up something in the Hebrew language, you want to take, a script. Let's say you want to take Psalms 1 and you want to look up the Hebrew version of what Psalms chapter 1, verse 1 is. What does it say in Hebrew? 9 times out of 10, you are going to get modern Hebrew, aka Aramaic. And how we know that this is of a truth, that around the time period of our ancestors being taken into captivity, that language that the Babylonians were speaking during that time period ended up adopting this Aramaic script, right? Taken obviously originally from our culture, but intertwined into the Babylonian culture, is because guess what? The majority of people who are historians, when it comes to translations, they will tell you that you don't start to see Aramaic in the translation of scripts until the book of Daniel, right? Do your history, right? Do some research, verify this on your own. But for the most part, that's when you'll start to see, when it comes to the translations, the translators going back to the Septuagint, right? Because remember, all this stuff is documented, right? It was around the time period of Daniel when you start to see modern or Aramaic script being used in the translation of our manuscript, right? So While the majority of the Hebrew texts of the first century BCE and into the first century CE AD were written in the late Semitic or Aramaic script, the middle script was not lost. It was still used on occasion on many of the coins and scrolls, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So again, the Dead Sea Scrolls is another example of writings that date back to that time period. But guess what script it actually was used? It wasn't the modern Hebrew. It wasn't Aramaic. It was the middle script. It was Paleo. So you know that for a very long time period, for really like the base of where the Torah, the prophets, and the majority of the scriptures were written in, man, it was Paleo, right? So that's the most accurate when it comes to the Hebrew language. That's the most accurate. I'm gonna say that again. When it comes to the Hebrew language, that's the most accurate when it comes to what version of Hebrew our scripts were written in for the most part, right? And when you study the pictograph, it just takes you deeper into the culture and gives you even better understanding of the Paleo or the middle script, right? Another thing too, right, is that the Samaritans that lived in the land of Samaria, which, by the way, this is like the Northern Kingdom. This was the Northern Kingdom that had already technically been taken into exile by the king of Ashur, right? They were already in, to a certain degree, captivity when our descendants of the Southern Kingdom, which would, be made up of the tribes Yehuda, Benjamin, and Levi. When we were taken into captivity during that time period, they were already in captivity, right? In the Northern Kingdom, which is also known as the land of Samaria. And you can read about this in 2 Kings chapter like 16, 17. But what happened is our people ended up in the Northern Kingdom, ended up intertwining with Samaria and Assyria, and they became kind of like one people. So you would see people worshiping Yah and Baal and all the other Els, the other gods that were being worshipped in that area. And also as a result of that, right, dealing with the language, right, you'll see that a lot of them are only, I guess they only retained a middle Semitic script, right? Because the culture was still used in that form to this day. So they were still using the middle Semitic script when, again, our ancestors from the Southern Kingdom that were taken into Babylon into another country, another nation, they began to use the late Semitic script, also known as Aramaic, right? And even to this very day, right, Jeff Bennett talks about it in the ancient Hebrew lexicon, there are still many people in the land of Samaria, right, which would technically be the northern kingdom of Israel, modern day like Turkey, right, the areas north of Yisrael, they still use a middle Semitic script, right? And again, these things are documented. I don't have an incentive or a reason to lie to you or make these things up, right? So, and again, this is how you know that the idea of even the Samaritan community, this is accurate. An example of this, matter of fact, if you go to John chapter 4, matter of fact, let's go there real quick. John chapter 4, right? Yahuchanan, the Basor, the Gospel of John chapter 4. This is told. Right? You'll see that Yahusha had a scenario with the Samaritan woman, right? And they were obviously able to understand each other because they both spoke Hebrew. They both spoke Avrit, right? But look at this. This is the Basura of John chapter 4. I'm gonna just read. I'm only gonna read a couple verses of this. We don't have to read the whole thing, but I'm gonna read at verse 7 where it says, "There came a woman of Samaria to drink water. Yahusha said unto her, Give me to drink. For his Talmudim were gone away into the city to buy food. Then said the woman of Samaria to him, How is it that you, being a Yehudi, ask drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Yahudim have no dealings with the Samaritans." Pause. This is how you know that there was an enmity, right, between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, because she's even recognizing him. She knows that he's from Yehuda, right? And she's pointing out to him, like, how do you even have dealings with me when, our tribes don't rock with each other, right? Look at his response. Yahusha answered and said unto you, if you knew the gift of Elohim and who it is that says to you, give me to drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. The woman said to him, Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence have you taken the living water? Are you greater than look at this, our father Yaakov? Very specific verbiage here. She said, our father Yaakov, telling you she's an Israelite, telling you she's from the northern kingdom, right? Our father Yaakov, which gave us the well and drink thereof himself and his children and his cattle. So we don't even have to keep reading on the script. I was just using that to show you that the majority of those Samaritans, right, they were Hebrews from the northern kingdom that went into exile. And again, you can read about this if you read 2 Kings chapter 16 and 17. You'll see, right, that Yahuwah basically allowed them to be intermingled with the king of Assyria and the Assyrians, which eventually became known as the land of Samaria. And there they still use the middle or the paleo script, right? It's not random. So again, those are the three, like I said, the three major, and it's important to know this history because a lot of people fail to perceive that there is a lot of Western influence even on Aramaic because of the Babylonian influence, the Babylonian captivity. Even when you look at the modern Hebrew language, or even if you try to see what are the Hebrew months, most of those Hebrew months, right, are going to have Babylonian names to them, right? You're actually going to have a Babylonian or a Hebrew month by the name of Tammuz. What? But that's, again, because it all goes back to that captivity, that Babylonian captivity, that time period, right? That time period where they ended up developing a script that was ultimately based off of, again, originally our pictograph, then our paleo or middle script, and then ultimately that was when, after that, was moving into captivity where the Aramaic, also known as the modern script, became a thing, right? So, last thing I want to deal with before we shut it down is going to be Greek, because oftentimes you're going to hear people say, oftentimes hear people say, yeah, the New Testament was written in Greek and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. It's a big lie. The whole script was written in Hebrew. Later, watch this, translated to Greek. And then after that, translated to English. Now, why would it be translated to Greek? It had to be translated to Greek because the men, well, I don't say the authors, but the writers that Yah moved on to write the Basora and the writings, also known as the epistles, like Paul, right? Also known, well, really Shaul, but known as Paul, right? Peter, which his Hebrew name is Kepha, right? James, Hebrew name Yaakov, right? Jude, Hebrew name Yehuda. All of these men, including Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Yahuchanan again, John, that we just read from, all of these individuals are Hebrews. So guess what language they spoke? Hebrew. And you know that this is of a truth because there are still copies of the book of Matthew, floating around. Really copies of a lot of the Besoras, but again, because the Vatican is very secretive and they don't want to release their vaults and open up the truth of matters. But there are a lot of European museums and places where these documents are hidden and locked up because a certain group of people doesn't want you to know what the truth is. But listen, the originals of these books was all written in Hebrew. They were later translated to Greek. Because what happened after 70 AD when Rome took over Israel, they had to translate everything to Greek at that point. Right? Yeah, you had some people who spoke Greek during that time period because there was technically already a type of captivity that was going forth, right? With Herod, who was an Edomite, which that's a whole nother can of worms, a topic that I'm going to have to address at a later point. But just know that, yeah, Them scripts was translated to Greek after they were written by the Talmudim, or the disciples, the followers of Yahusha, who were all Hebrew men. Because notice what Yahusha says. He says, look, in a couple places in Matthew and Mark, a bunch of places in the Besorah, he says, listen, go to the Yahudim first. Then go to the uttermost parts of Judea. He's talking about the northern kingdom. Oh, I'm sorry. Then go to the northern kingdom, right? Then the outermost parts of the earth, which would be the Gentile nations. So this is how you know for a fact that not only was the scripts written in Hebrew, but what is the order of salvation? Yahuwah through Yahusha said, go to the Yahudim, the tribe of Judah first. That's where you even get that term Jew from. It's one who was from the tribe of Yehuda. Hair like lamb's wool, skin like bronze, as if it had been burnt from the fire, right? You can see it to this day, man. Like, I'm not gonna mention it, but there's a certain country that is opening up their vaults and showing you images of what Mashiach looked like, right? They might not have the names, they might not have the Hebrew names and all that other stuff, because the majority of the world is Christianized, but they showing you the original images of what Mashiach and the disciples looked like. I'm trying to tell you, they had afros, braids, right? Darker than me. So what I'm telling you is of a truth. And what I'm telling you is that for every word that Yah has spoken, there's a depth and a root and a meaning to it that gives us insight that the script is not just the script that we follow in the book of life. It is our history, right? You want to talk about quote unquote black history. You want to talk about Hebrew history. Open up the script. And if we open up the script, we got to learn the depth of the culture behind the language that our script, our manuscript, was originally written in, family. So, hallelujah. Not as long of a lesson today. Next week, hopefully we can keep going and deal with some deeper topics. Hopefully we can get to, some of the reconstruction and y'all willing, maybe some of the letters, because at a certain point, we definitely going to go over all the letters of the ancient Hebrew AlephBet. And then we're going to get into some other Ruach things as well, as Yahuwah resets and retunes our frequency to his. I love you all. Much ahav. Shalom to everybody tuning in. Again, if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to us at truth@resetthefrequency.com. And yeah, we'll get back with you, Yah willing, as we supplicate with Yah's Ruach and Yahuwah's timing. Much ahav, which is love, and shalom, which is peace and wholeness to you all.